No other decade in modern history packed more change into 10 years than the 1970s. And most people alive today have no idea just how wild it really was. A president resigned on live television. A war that tore a nation apart finally ended. Humans stopped going to the moon. Disco conquered the planet, then died almost overnight. A computer was built in a garage that would eventually change civilization. And somewhere between all of that, ordinary people were living through what many still call the single greatest decade in history. This was a decade that redefined music, fashion, politics, technology, and the way human beings thought about themselves. The optimism of the 1960s had cracked, and what replaced it was something raw, honest, and electric. People stopped pretending the world was perfect and started building something real. The 1970s gave us punk rock and disco, Star Wars and The Godfather, Muhammad Ali and Bruce Lee. It gave us the environmental movement, the women's movement, and a cultural revolution that touched every corner of the globe. Let's walk through the entire decade, year by year, moment by moment. Some of this might bring back memories. Some of it might reshape how you see the world. Let's step into the 1970s. The decade opened in turmoil. The Vietnam War was raging. American troops were still fighting and dying in Southeast Asia, and back home protests were intensifying. In May of 1970, National Guard soldiers opened fire on student protesters at Kent State University in Ohio. 4 students were killed. The images shocked the nation and the world. The idea that a government would shoot its own young people on a college campus felt like the fracturing of something fundamental. The anti-war movement exploded. Millions marched. Trust in institutions began to erode in ways that would define the rest of the decade. But 1970 also brought moments of wonder. The Beatles officially broke up, ending an era. From the ashes, solo careers emerged. John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr each went on to create music that stood on its own. The first Earth Day was celebrated on April 22, 1970, marking the birth of the modern environmental movement. 20 million Americans participated. The air was thick with smog in cities across the country. Rivers were polluted. The Cuyahoga River in Ohio had literally caught fire. Earth Day signaled that people had had enough. The Environmental Protection Agency was established later that year. By 1971, the cultural shift was accelerating. The voting age in the United States was lowered to 18 with the 26th Amendment. If young people were old enough to fight in Vietnam, they were old enough to vote. The Pentagon Papers were published, revealing that the government had systematically lied to the public about the Vietnam War for years. Trust in authority took another devastating blow. Meanwhile, the world was watching a new kind of athlete emerge. In 1971, the fight between Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier at Madison Square Garden became the biggest sporting event in history to that point. 2 undefeated heavyweight champions faced each other. The drama transcended boxing. It was cultural, political, and deeply personal. The year 1972 brought seismic events. The Watergate break-in occurred in June, though its full significance would not become clear for 2 more years. President Nixon's men broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters, setting off a chain of events that would bring down a presidency. Meanwhile, Nixon visited China, opening diplomatic relations for the first time in decades. The Cold War chessboard shifted overnight. The Munich Olympics were marred by tragedy when Palestinian terrorists took Israeli athletes hostage. 11 Israelis were killed. The massacre shocked the world and changed how nations thought about security forever. In 1973, the world changed again. The oil crisis hit when Arab nations imposed an embargo following the Yom Kippur War. Gas prices skyrocketed. Lines at gas stations stretched for blocks. Speed limits were reduced to 55 miles per hour to conserve fuel. The era of cheap, endless energy was over. People suddenly realized how dependent modern life had become on oil. The crisis rippled through every economy on the planet. Inflation surged. The carefree abundance of the post-war decades felt like it was slipping away. But the same year also saw the end of direct American military involvement in Vietnam. The Paris Peace Accords were signed in January 1973, and American troops came home. The war would continue for 2 more years, but for Americans, the longest and most divisive conflict since the Civil War was winding down. Returning veterans faced a country that did not know how to welcome them. There were no parades. Many struggled with what we now call post-traumatic stress. The nation was exhausted and divided. Before we continue with the cultural explosion and innovation that defined the rest of the decade, if you are enjoying this journey through the 1970s and want to explore more decades and the moments that shaped our world, consider subscribing. There are so many more stories about how we got to where we are today. The year 1974 belonged to Watergate. The scandal consumed the nation. Televised hearings captivated millions. The evidence mounted. Tape recordings revealed that Nixon had been involved in covering up the break-in. On August 9, 1974, Richard Nixon became the first American president to resign from office. Gerald Ford took over and controversially pardoned Nixon, a decision that haunted Ford's presidency. The entire episode fundamentally altered how Americans viewed their government. Cynicism replaced trust. The phrase, "follow the money," entered the national vocabulary. By the mid-1970s, the cultural landscape was transforming at breathtaking speed. Music was fracturing into genres that would define generations. Disco was rising. Dance clubs filled with mirror balls and pulsing bass lines became the social centers of cities around the world. The Bee Gees, Donna Summer, and KC and the Sunshine Band provided the soundtrack. People dressed up, went out, and danced until morning. It was exuberant, glamorous, and unapologetically fun. At the same time, punk rock was being born in the opposite direction. In New York, bands were playing fast, raw, aggressive music in tiny clubs. In London, the movement exploded into the mainstream, rejecting everything polished and commercial. Punk was rebellion distilled into 3 chords and anger. It gave voice to young people who felt shut out of the system. Rock music was reaching new heights of ambition. Progressive rock bands created sprawling, complex compositions. Singer-songwriters poured personal stories into acoustic ballads. Funk and soul were innovating. Reggae was spreading from Jamaica to the world, carrying messages of resistance and spirituality. The 1970s were arguably the richest decade in the history of popular music because every genre was pushing boundaries simultaneously. Film was experiencing its own golden age. The early 1970s saw a wave of groundbreaking cinema. The Godfather in 1972 redefined the crime genre. The Exorcist in 1973 terrified audiences. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in 1975 swept the major Academy Awards. Jaws in 1975 invented the summer blockbuster and changed how movies were marketed forever. And then in 1977, Star Wars arrived, and nothing was ever the same. George Lucas created a universe that captured the imagination of the entire planet. Lines wrapped around city blocks. People saw it dozens of times. It proved that cinema could create modern mythology. Television was evolving too. Shows began tackling social issues with unprecedented honesty. Programs addressed racism, poverty, and class in ways that had never been attempted. Saturday Night Live launched in 1975, bringing a new kind of comedy to late-night television that combined political satire with absurdist humor. Television was no longer just entertainment, it was cultural commentary. Technology in the late 1970s was quietly laying the groundwork for the future. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak founded Apple in 1976. The personal computer was born. It seemed like a curiosity at the time, something for hobbyists and engineers. Nobody understood that it would eventually reshape every aspect of human life. Atari brought video games into living rooms. The first generation of kids who grew up with screens and controllers was being formed. The space program, which had defined the 1960s, wound down in the 1970s. The last moon landing happened in December 1972. Skylab orbited Earth. The Apollo-Soyuz mission in 1975 saw American and Soviet spacecraft dock together for the first time, a small moment of cooperation during the Cold War. But the era of moonshots was over, and the focus shifted to more practical concerns. Fashion in the 1970s was unforgettable. People wore bell-bottoms, platform shoes, and polyester shirts with wide collars. Earth tones dominated the early part of the decade before giving way to the bright colors and glitter of disco. Men wore their hair long. Women embraced natural looks before the glamour of the late 1970s took hold. Fashion was expressive and bold. People dressed to be noticed. The women's movement gained enormous momentum throughout the decade. More women entered the workforce than ever before. Legal protections expanded. The conversation about equality moved from the margins to the mainstream. Title IX was enacted in 1972, requiring equal opportunities in education, which transformed women's athletics forever. The decade closed with the Iranian Revolution in 1979, when the Shah was overthrown and American embassy staff were taken hostage. The crisis would define the transition into the 1980s. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in December 1979, setting off a conflict with consequences that would echo for decades. What defined the 1970s was honesty. The illusions of the previous decades had been stripped away. Governments lied and were caught. Wars were questioned and ended. Movements for equality and environmental protection gained real power. People demanded authenticity in their music, their politics, and their daily lives. The decade had its darkness. Economic uncertainty, political scandal, energy crises, and social upheaval tested people in ways they had not expected. But it also had extraordinary creativity, courage, and joy. The music alone would be enough to make it legendary. Add the films, the social progress, the technological seeds that were planted, and you have a decade unlike any other. For those who lived through the 1970s, the memories are vivid. The sounds, the colors, the feeling that the world was being remade in real time. It was messy, complicated, and thrilling. And for many, it remains the best decade in history. For those with memories of this remarkable era, there is always more history to explore.